The crack of the bat echoed across Camp Shelby, Mississippi, on a sweltering August afternoon in 1943, but it wasn't the sound that stopped Lieutenant Hiroshi Tanaka in his tracks. It was the laughter. American soldiers, the same men who had captured him just months before at Guadalcanal, were laughing together, slapping each other's backs, arguing playfully about a call at second base. For the first time since his capture, Hiroshi felt something other than shame burning in his chest. It was curiosity. You see, Hiroshi had been raised on the ancient code of Bushido, where honor meant death before surrender. Yet here he was, alive, breathing, watching his captors play what they called America's pastime. The irony wasn't lost on him. In Japan, he had been taught that Americans were soft, individualistic, lacking the discipline of the rising sun. But watching these men on the diamond, he saw something that challenged everything he thought he knew. The war had been going poorly for Japan by late 1942. Hiroshi, a former university student turned reluctant soldier, found himself on a transport ship heading toward what would become one of the bloodiest campaigns in the Pacific. Guadalcanal was supposed to be Japan's stepping stone to Australia, but it became a nightmare of mud, disease, and constant bombardment. For 6 months, Hiroshi watched his comrades fall to American artillery, malaria, and starvation. When the order came to retreat, he was among the last to leave his position. A mortar shell blast knocked him unconscious, and he woke up in American hands. The shame was overwhelming. In his culture, capture meant dishonor not just for him, but for his entire family back in Kyoto. His father, a respected professor, had sent him off to war with words about duty and honor. His younger sister had sewn good luck charms into his uniform. His mother had pressed a small photo of the family into his hand at the train station. Now, that photo was all he had left of a life that felt increasingly distant. Camp Shelby wasn't like the prisoner camps in the movies. The Americans treated their Japanese prisoners according to the Geneva Convention, which meant regular meals, medical care, and surprisingly, recreational activities. Most of Hiroshi's fellow prisoners spent their time in bitter contemplation, writing letters they'd never send, or engaging in heated debates about when the Japanese Navy would come to rescue them. But Hiroshi found himself drawn to the fence that separated the prisoner compound from the main base, where every afternoon, American soldiers gathered for their peculiar ritual. Baseball, they called it. At first, it looked chaotic to Hiroshi's eyes. 9 men scattered across a field, one throwing a small white ball at another holding a wooden stick, while others stood waiting, some closer, some farther away. It seemed random, lacking the rigid formations and precise movements he associated with proper military discipline. But day after day, he watched, and slowly, patterns began to emerge. There was strategy here, more complex than he'd initially realized. The pitcher wasn't just throwing the ball, he was thinking, calculating, trying to outwit the batter. The fielders weren't just standing around, they were anticipating, communicating with subtle gestures and calls. And the batters weren't just swinging wildly, they were waiting, studying, looking for their moment. It reminded him, oddly, of the game of Go that his grandfather had taught him as a child. Simple rules creating infinite possibilities. But what struck him most wasn't the strategy. It was the emotion. These American soldiers celebrated each other's successes with genuine joy. When someone hit the ball well, teammates cheered as loudly as if they'd won a battle. When someone made an error, others offered encouragement instead of criticism. There was discipline, yes, but it was self-imposed, emerging from respect for the game and for each other rather than fear of punishment. One afternoon in September, as Hiroshi pressed his face against the chain-link fence, a baseball rolled toward him. It had been hit foul, bouncing off the backstop and rolling across the dusty ground. Without thinking, he reached through the fence and picked it up. The leather was worn smooth, the red stitching slightly frayed. He could feel the weight of it in his palm, solid and substantial. For a moment, he understood the appeal. This small sphere contained possibility, potential energy waiting to be released. "Hey, buddy, you gonna throw that back or keep it as a souvenir?" The voice belonged to a tall, lanky soldier with kind eyes and a southern drawl. Staff Sergeant Bobby McKenna had been watching Hiroshi watch their games for weeks. Unlike many of his fellow soldiers, Bobby didn't see the Japanese prisoners as monsters or even enemies anymore. He saw them as young men, far from home, caught up in something bigger than themselves. It was a perspective that had gotten him in trouble with some of his superiors, but Bobby had always been more interested in doing what was right than what was expected. Hiroshi hesitated, then tossed the ball back through the fence. Bobby caught it with an easy motion, then surprised everyone by walking closer to the fence. "You've been watching us play for weeks now," Bobby said, his voice casual but not unkind. "You understand any of it?" Hiroshi's English was better than most of his fellow prisoners, learned during his university years when he dreamed of becoming a diplomat. "Little bit," he said carefully. "Is complicated game." Bobby laughed, but not mockingly. "That it is, friend. That it surely is. Been playing since I was knee-high to a grasshopper back in Alabama, and I'm still learning something new every game." He paused, studying Hiroshi's face. "What's your name, if you don't mind me asking?" "Tanaka Hiroshi," he replied, giving his family name first in the Japanese tradition. "Well, Hiroshi Tanaka," Bobby said, unconsciously reversing the order to match American custom. "I'm Bobby McKenna. And I got a question for you. You ever want to try it? Playing, I mean." The question hung in the air like a curveball, unexpected and impossible to ignore. Hiroshi felt his heart rate increase. The idea was absurd, dangerous even. What would his fellow prisoners think? What would the other American soldiers say? What would the camp commander do? But before his rational mind could formulate all the reasons why it was impossible, he found himself nodding. "I would like to try," he said quietly. Bobby's grin was infectious. "Well, I'll be damned. Let me talk to some folks, see what we can work out." That night, Hiroshi lay on his narrow cot in the prisoner barracks, staring at the ceiling and wondering what he'd gotten himself into. Around him, his fellow prisoners slept fitfully, some muttering in their dreams, others turning restlessly on the thin mattresses. He thought about his father, who had taught him that a man's character was revealed not in victory but in defeat. He thought about his sister, who had always been braver than him, speaking her mind even when it got her in trouble with their traditional grandmother. He thought about his mother, whose gentle strength had held their family together through years of increasing militarization and war fever. What would they think of him now, contemplating playing games with the enemy? Was this adaptation or betrayal? Survival or surrender of something deeper than life itself? 3 days later, Bobby approached the fence again, this time carrying a worn baseball glove and a bat that had seen better days. "Got permission from the CO," he said, his excitement barely contained. "Nothing official, mind you, and you'll have to stay on your side of the fence to start with. But we can teach you to catch, maybe let you take a few swings." Word spread quickly through both sides of the camp. Some American soldiers were curious, others openly hostile. "Teaching baseball to a Jap," one muttered loud enough for everyone to hear. "What's next? Inviting them to Sunday dinner?" But Bobby had allies too. Corporal James Washington, a quiet man from Detroit who'd grown up playing sandlot ball, thought it might be good for morale. "Maybe their morale and ours," he'd said thoughtfully. "Remind us all we're fighting a war, not people." Private Tony Rickey from Brooklyn was more practical. My nonna always said you judge a man by how he treats his enemies. Maybe this is our chance to show we ain't savages." On the Japanese side, the reaction was even more intense. Some prisoners accused Hiroshi of collaboration, of betraying the emperor and dishonouring their shared suffering. Others were simply confused. Why would he want to fraternize with their captors? What could possibly be gained? But there were a few, like Kenji Nakamura, a former teacher from Osaka, who saw something different. "Perhaps," he said quietly during one of their evening discussions, "this is not about them or us. Perhaps this is about remembering who we were before the war, and who we might be after it ends." The first lesson was awkward, almost comical. Hiroshi had never held a baseball glove, and the concept of catching a thrown ball with a leather mitt was foreign to him. His natural instinct was to use his hands, but Bobby patiently showed him how to position the glove, how to keep his eye on the ball, how to cushion the impact. "It's all about trust," Bobby explained as he tossed easy grounders through the fence. "Trusting the glove to do its job, trusting your hands to know what to do, trusting that the ball's gonna go where you think it's gonna go." Trust. The word echoed in Hiroshi's mind as he fumbled through those first attempts. Trust had been a casualty of war for him, maybe the first casualty. He'd stopped trusting his government when they'd sent him to die on a distant island. He'd stopped trusting his training when American firepower proved superior to Japanese spirit. He'd stopped trusting himself when he'd chosen life over honor. But here, in this simple act of catching and throwing a ball, he felt something rebuilding. By the end of that first week, Hiroshi could catch most of the balls Bobby threw his way. His fellow prisoners had stopped their vocal protests, though many still watched with disapproving silence. The American soldiers had largely grown used to the sight of the Japanese prisoner taking fielding practice through the fence. It was becoming routine, this small bridge between two worlds. But routine has a way of breeding complacency, and complacency can lead to unexpected opportunities. It was a Saturday afternoon in October when everything changed. The American team was short a player. Food poisoning had laid low 3 of their regulars, and they needed bodies to field a full 9. Bobby had been teaching Hiroshi not just to catch, but to understand the game's rhythm, its strategy, its unspoken rules. On impulse, he approached his captain with a proposal that would have seemed insane just months before. "Cap'n, I know this sounds crazy, but what if we let Hiroshi play? Just for today, just to fill out the roster?" Captain Mitchell looked at Bobby as if he'd suggested inviting Hitler himself to take batting practice. "Sergeant, are you out of your ever-loving mind? We're talking about a prisoner of war here, not some kid from the local high school." "I know, sir, but hear me out. The man's been learning the game for weeks now. He understands it better than most folks back home. And it's not like he's going anywhere. We got guards, we got the fence, we got procedures. What's the harm in letting him play one game?" Captain Mitchell was a career military man, but he was also pragmatic. The recreational baseball game served an important purpose in maintaining morale among his troops. And if word got back to headquarters that they'd had to cancel games due to lack of players, it might reflect poorly on his command. Still, the idea of putting a Japanese prisoner on the field with American soldiers was unprecedented. What about the other prisoners? What about my men? What about protocol? Bobby had thought about this. As for the other prisoners, well, they'll still be on their side of the fence, same as always. As for our men, I think most of them are curious to see what he can do. And as for protocol, well, sir, sometimes protocol needs to bend a little in the name of keeping our boys' spirits up. It was a masterful argument, appealing to both practical necessity and higher purpose. Captain Mitchell found himself considering something he would have rejected out of hand just months before. The war had a way of changing people's perspectives on what was possible, what was necessary, and what was right. "One game," he said finally, "and he stays in the outfield, away from the other players as much as possible. And if anything goes wrong, anything at all, it's on your head, Sergeant." Bobby's grin could have powered the entire base. "Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. You won't regret this." As he walked back toward the fence to deliver the news, Bobby wondered if he was making a promise he could keep. But looking at Hiroshi's face when he explained what had been arranged, seeing the mixture of excitement, terror, and gratitude there, he felt certain he was doing something right, even if he couldn't quite explain what it was. That afternoon, for the first time since his capture, Hiroshi Tanaka walked through the gate that separated the prisoner compound from the main base. He wore a borrowed American uniform, carried a borrowed glove, and felt the weight of dozens of eyes watching his every move. Behind him, pressed against the fence, his fellow prisoners watched in silence. Some with anger, some with curiosity, some with something that might have been hope. As he took his position in right field, Hiroshi felt the October sun warm on his face and thought about his father's lessons on character. Perhaps this was his test, his chance to prove that honor could be found not just in death, but in the courage to build bridges across the deepest divides. As the first pitch of the game sailed toward home plate, he whispered a small prayer to ancestors he'd never see again, asking not for victory, but for the wisdom to understand what victory might look like in a world turned upside down by war. The first inning was a disaster waiting to happen. Hiroshi stood in right field, his borrowed glove feeling foreign on his hand, his heart pounding so hard he was certain the American soldiers could hear it from the dugout. Every muscle in his body was tense, waiting for the crack of the bat that would send a ball his way and test whether weeks of practice through a fence had prepared him for the real thing. But baseball, like war, rarely unfolds according to expectations. The first three batters grounded out to the infield, and Hiroshi never had to move. As he jogged back to the dugout, he caught Bobby's eye and saw an encouraging nod. 1 inning down, 8 to go. The American team was batting first, and Hiroshi found himself sitting on the bench, watching his temporary teammates take their turns at the plate. The casual banter between players struck him as remarkable. In the Japanese military, such informality between ranks would have been unthinkable. Here, a private could joke with a sergeant, a corporal could offer advice to a lieutenant, all bound together by something that transcended military hierarchy. "You're up 7th in the batting order," Bobby told him quietly. "Don't worry about trying to hit a home run or anything fancy. Just make contact if you can, and if you can't, well, striking out is part of the game too." Striking out. The phrase had a different meaning for Hiroshi than it did for the Americans. In his culture, failure was shameful, something to be avoided at all costs. But watching these soldiers, he began to understand that in baseball, as perhaps in life, failure was simply part of the process. Even the best players failed more often than they succeeded. The difference was in how they responded to that failure. The third inning brought his first real test. A sharp line drive came screaming toward right field, and for a moment, Hiroshi's mind went blank. All the practice, all the instruction, all the careful positioning, it all disappeared in the face of that small white sphere hurtling toward him at what seemed like impossible speed. But then, muscle memory kicked in. He moved instinctively, tracking the ball's flight, positioning his glove, and somehow, miraculously, the ball settled into the leather pocket with a satisfying thunk. The cheer that went up from the American dugout was unlike anything he'd experienced. These men, his captors, his former enemies, were celebrating his success as if it were their own. Even some of the Japanese prisoners watching from behind the fence allowed themselves small smiles of approval. For that one moment, nationality and uniform and the bitter history between their countries seemed to matter less than the simple human joy of a ball caught cleanly on a sunny afternoon. The game ended with a 7-4 victory for Hiroshi's team. As the players shook hands in the traditional post-game ritual, Hiroshi found himself face-to-face with Rodriguez, the pitcher who had thrown to him. For a moment, the Texan studied his face, and Hiroshi prepared for hostility or at least suspicion. Instead, Rodriguez extended his hand with a slight smile. "Good at-bat, son. You kept your eye on the ball and stayed patient. That's more than some of these knuckleheads can manage." He gestured toward his own teammates with mock disgust, earning laughs from both benches. As Hiroshi walked back toward the prisoner compound, still wearing his borrowed American uniform, he reflected on what had changed in those few hours on the diamond. It wasn't that the war had suddenly ended or that the fundamental differences between their countries had been resolved. It was something smaller but no less significant. He had been seen, truly seen, as an individual rather than as a representative of an enemy nation. That night, the prisoner barracks were unusually quiet. Some of his fellow prisoners were angry, accusing him of betraying their shared suffering for the entertainment of their captors. Others were curious, asking detailed questions about what it had felt like to play alongside Americans. A few, like Kenji, were thoughtful, wondering aloud whether this strange episode might represent something larger about human nature and the possibility for understanding across even the deepest divides. "Tell me," Kenji asked as they lay on their narrow cots, "when you were standing on that baseball field, what did you feel? Shame? Pride? Confusion?" Hiroshi considered the question carefully. "I felt alive," he said finally. "For the first time since my capture, I felt like myself again. Not a prisoner, not a failure, not a disgrace to my family. Just myself." It was an answer that satisfied no one completely, but it was honest. And in the strange world they now inhabited, honesty felt like the beginning of something important, even if none of them could quite name what that something might be. Word of the game spread quickly through the camp, and reactions were mixed. Some American soldiers thought it was a dangerous precedent, fraternizing with the enemy in a way that might undermine military discipline. Others saw it as proof of American values, demonstrating that even in wartime, they could maintain their humanity and sense of fair play. Captain Mitchell found himself fielding questions from his superiors about this unusual breach of protocol. How had it happened? What were the security implications? What message did it send about American resolve in prosecuting the war? His responses were careful, emphasizing the practical benefits for morale and the tight security measures that had been maintained throughout. But privately, he found himself thinking about something his grandfather, a veteran of the First World War, had once told him: "Son, the real victory in any war isn't just defeating the enemy. It's making sure you don't become something you can't live with after the fighting stops." For Bobby, the success of that first game opened up possibilities he hadn't dared to imagine. If Hiroshi could play once, why not regularly? If one Japanese prisoner could participate in American recreational activities without incident, what did that say about the potential for broader understanding? But Bobby was also realistic about the challenges. The war was far from over, and anti-Japanese sentiment among both military personnel and civilians back home remained intense. Any misstep, Any incident that could be interpreted as coddling the enemy could have serious consequences for his career and for the prisoners under their care. The solution he proposed to Captain Mitchell was characteristically practical. What if they formalized the arrangement, making it an official part of the camp's rehabilitation program? There was precedent for using recreational activities to maintain prisoner morale and cooperation. Baseball could be presented as a tool for keeping the Japanese prisoners physically fit and mentally occupied, reducing the likelihood of escape attempts or other disciplinary problems. Captain Mitchell was skeptical. "You're asking me to approve a program that puts enemy soldiers on American baseball fields in the name of rehabilitation? Do you understand how that's going to look in my reports?" "Sir, with respect, I'm asking you to approve a program that's already working. We've seen the results. The prisoners are more cooperative, our men's morale is up, and we've had 0 security incidents. Sometimes the best policy is the one that's already succeeding." It was a persuasive argument, backed by tangible results. After consulting with his superiors and receiving surprisingly little resistance, Captain Mitchell approved a limited pilot program. Selected Japanese prisoners who demonstrated good behavior and language skills could participate in recreational activities with American personnel, under strict supervision and with clear guidelines for interaction. Hiroshi was among the first 5 prisoners selected for the program. Along with Kenji, who had been a literature teacher before the war, and 3 others who had shown both language aptitude and what the camp psychologist termed adaptive attitudes, he would be allowed to participate in regular baseball games, educational discussions, and even some work details alongside American soldiers. The selection process caused considerable tension within the prisoner population. Those chosen were accused by some of their peers of collaboration, of abandoning their duty to maintain resistance against their captors. Those not chosen felt betrayed, as if their loyalty to Japan was being questioned. For Hiroshi, the selection brought both opportunity and burden. He understood that he was being given a rare chance to bridge 2 worlds, to demonstrate that understanding was possible even across the vast chasm of war. But he also understood that he was being watched by everyone, his fellow prisoners, his American captors, and probably intelligence officers whose job it was to assess the risks and benefits of such unprecedented cooperation. The second official game was scheduled for a Saturday afternoon in late October. This time, there was no shortage of players, no emergency substitutions. Hiroshi was included because the program had deemed his participation valuable, not because he was needed to fill out a roster. The pressure felt different, heavier somehow. As he took the field for the first inning, Hiroshi noticed that the crowd of observers had grown. More American soldiers had come to watch, drawn by curiosity about this unusual experiment. Behind the fence, nearly every Japanese prisoner in the compound had gathered to witness what many saw as a test of their collective honor. The game itself was closer, more competitive than the first one had been. Both teams played with an intensity that suggested the outcome mattered for reasons beyond recreation. For the Americans, there was pride in showing that their democratic values could extend even to enemy prisoners without compromising their effectiveness. For Hiroshi and the other Japanese participants, there was the weight of representing their people in this strange new form of diplomacy. In the 4th inning, Hiroshi made a mistake that nearly proved disastrous. A fly ball was hit in his direction, but the autumn sun was directly in his eyes as he tried to track its flight. He misjudged the angle, and the ball glanced off his glove for what should have been a routine out. The error allowed 2 runners to score, and for a moment, the familiar shame washed over him. But instead of the criticism he expected, his teammates rallied around him. "Shake it off, Hiroshi," called Washington from first base. "Sun'll get you every time if you're not careful." Bobby trotted out from the dugout to offer encouragement, and even some of the American spectators called out supportive comments. It was a small thing, but it taught Hiroshi something profound about American culture that he hadn't understood before. Failure was acknowledged, but it wasn't final. Mistakes were part of the game, part of the human experience, and the response to failure was not shame but support and encouragement to do better next time. That lesson would prove more important than anyone realized when, 2 weeks later, everything changed again. November brought news that would test every relationship, every bridge built, and every assumption challenged during those autumn weeks at Camp Shelby. Intelligence reports indicated that a group of Japanese prisoners at a facility in California had organized an escape attempt, resulting in the deaths of 2 American guards. The incident sent shockwaves through the entire prisoner of war system and triggered immediate policy reviews at every camp housing Japanese detainees. The morning after the news broke, Captain Mitchell called an emergency meeting with his senior staff. The mood was grim, the implications clear. Any program that could be seen as giving Japanese prisoners special treatment or access to American facilities would be immediately suspect. The baseball experiment, so carefully nurtured over the past months, was in serious jeopardy. "Gentlemen," Mitchell began, his voice heavy with the weight of command decisions, "I don't need to tell you that recent events have changed the landscape considerably. I'm getting pressure from 3 different levels of command to suspend all recreational programs involving enemy prisoners. The official word is that we've been too soft, too accommodating, and that recent events prove the danger of treating these men as anything other than potential threats." Bobby felt his heart sink. He looked around the room at the faces of his fellow officers, seeing his own disappointment reflected there. They had seen something special developing at Camp Shelby, something that transcended the usual categories of friend and enemy, us and them. The idea of throwing it all away because of events at a facility hundreds of miles away felt like a betrayal of everything they had learned about the possibility for human understanding. "Sir," Bobby said carefully, "what happened in California is tragic, and I don't mean to minimize it. But our situation here has been completely different. We've had 0 security incidents, improved cooperation from the prisoner population, and what I can only describe as a breakthrough in terms of mutual understanding. Are we really going to abandon a successful program because other people in other places made different choices?" Captain Mitchell looked at Bobby with something approaching sympathy. "Sergeant, I understand your investment in this program, and I share your belief in its value. But I also understand politics, and the politics right now are very clear. The American public is not in a mood for what they'll see as coddling enemy soldiers, regardless of the practical benefits. Congress is asking questions, newspapers are writing editorials, and my superiors are looking for any excuse to demonstrate that they're taking a hard line." The meeting continued for another hour, but the outcome was never really in doubt. The official recreational program involving Japanese prisoners was suspended indefinitely. Hiroshi and the others would return to the standard prisoner routine: work details, basic recreation within the compound, and minimal interaction with American personnel beyond what was absolutely necessary for camp administration. But Bobby McKenna had never been the sort of man to accept defeat easily, especially when he believed strongly in the cause. After the meeting, he sought out Corporal Washington and Private Ricky, 2 of the Americans who had become most invested in the cross-cultural experiment. "Look," he told them quietly, "official policy is official policy. But that doesn't mean everything we've learned has to disappear. These men aren't just prisoners anymore. They're people we know, people we've played ball with, people we've come to understand. That can't just be erased by some directive from headquarters." Washington nodded slowly. As an African-American soldier from Detroit, he understood something about being judged by category rather than character. "What are you thinking, Sarge?" "I'm thinking that policies can be interpreted different ways, and that sometimes the right thing to do isn't necessarily the officially approved thing to do. I'm thinking that maybe we find ways to maintain relationships that don't technically violate the new orders." It was a dangerous suggestion, the kind that could end careers if it went wrong. But it was also the kind of moral courage that defines character in moments of testing. Ricky, whose grandmother's wisdom about judging people by how they treated their enemies had shaped his own thinking, was immediately supportive. "Count me in, Sarge. These guys, especially Hiroshi, they're not our enemies anymore. They're just men caught up in something bigger than themselves, same as us." The challenge was how to maintain meaningful contact without violating the new restrictions. The solution they developed was creative, if technically questionable. Japanese prisoners were still assigned to work details around the base, and American soldiers were still responsible for supervising those details. If conversations happened during work, if small games of catch occurred during breaks, if the boundaries between supervisor and supervised became somewhat blurred, well, that was just efficient management of available human resources. For Hiroshi, the new restrictions were devastating at first. Just as he had begun to feel a sense of belonging, of purpose beyond mere survival, that opportunity had been taken away. The return to the routine of the prisoner compound felt like a step backward, not just in his daily life but in his understanding of what was possible between people of different nations and backgrounds. But the informal connections that Bobby and his allies maintained proved to be lifelines. During work details in the motor pool, Hiroshi found himself working alongside American soldiers who treated him not as a prisoner but as a colleague. During breaks, someone might produce a baseball and a few gloves, and suddenly a small game would develop, prisoner and guard playing together as if the new policies didn't exist. These moments were precious because they were fragile, dependent on the goodwill of individual soldiers and the willingness of supervisors to look the other way. They existed in the spaces between official policy and human connection, maintained by people who had decided that understanding was more important than regulations. It was during one of these informal sessions, in early December 1943, that events took a turn that would test every relationship built over the preceding months. Hiroshi was taking a break from engine maintenance, playing catch with Tony Ricky behind the motor pool, when they heard the sound that every soldier dreaded, the air raid siren. It wasn't a drill. Intelligence had discovered that a Japanese submarine had been spotted off the coast of Louisiana, and while the chance of an actual attack was small, protocols demanded that all facilities housing strategic resources be placed on high alert. For a prisoner of war camp, this meant immediate lockdown, with all prisoners secured in their compounds under heavy guard. The chaos that followed was unlike anything Camp Shelby had experienced. Guards rushed to their stations, officers barked orders through bullhorns, and the entire base transformed from a place of routine into a fortress preparing for possible attack. In the confusion, several critical mistakes were made, mistakes that would have tragic consequences. The first mistake was administrative. In the rush to secure all prisoners, the work details were recalled without proper coordination. Some prisoners were accounted for and returned to the compound, but others, including Hiroshi, were simply told to report to the nearest American supervisor for temporary detention until the lockdown procedures could be properly implemented. The second mistake was strategic. The base's communication systems, overwhelmed by simultaneous alerts and status reports, experienced significant delays. Critical information about prisoner locations and guard assignments was lost in the flood of radio traffic, leaving some areas of the base effectively unsupervised. The third mistake was human. Sergeant Pete Kowalski, a recent transfer from a base in California where he had been involved in the bloody escape attempt that had triggered the new policies, was on duty at the communication center when the alerts began. Already suspicious of what he saw as the overly friendly relationship between guards and prisoners at Camp Shelby, he interpreted the confusion as evidence of a coordinated escape attempt. Without waiting for orders or confirmation, Kowalski began spreading word that Japanese prisoners were attempting to use the alert as cover for a breakout. Within minutes, rumors were flying through the base. Prisoners had been seen near the armory, guards had been overpowered, American soldiers were missing and presumed captured or worse. None of it was true, but in the fog of war, truth becomes the first casualty. Within 20 minutes, armed guards were conducting aggressive searches of every building, treating every Japanese face as a potential threat rather than recognizing the individuals they had worked and played alongside for months. Hiroshi found himself caught in the worst possible position. He was outside the prisoner compound when the lockdown began, separated from his fellow prisoners and unable to prove his location to guards who no longer saw him as the reliable teammate who had turned double plays and shared quiet conversations about literature and home. To Sergeant Kowalski and the guards under his influence, Hiroshi was simply an enemy soldier found outside his designated area during a security alert. The confrontation happened near the baseball diamond, the same field where just weeks before, Hiroshi had experienced his first taste of belonging in this strange American world. Kowalski approached with 3 other guards, weapons drawn, voices sharp with adrenaline and suspicion. "You," Kowalski barked, his rifle pointed at Hiroshi's chest. "What are you doing out here? Where are the other prisoners? What's your part in this?" Hiroshi raised his hand slowly, his mind racing through possible responses. He could explain about the work detail, about the confusion during the alert, about the months of cooperation and friendship that had brought him to this moment. But looking at Kowalski's face, seeing the fear and anger there, he realized that explanations would be useless. This man had already decided who Hiroshi was and what he represented. "I was working," Hiroshi said carefully, his English precise despite the stress. "Motor pool detail." Siren sounded. "Corporal Washington told me to wait for instructions." "Corporal Washington?" Kowalski's voice dripped with contempt. "Let me guess, another bleeding heart who thinks you Japs are just misunderstood. Well, I've seen what you people do when given the chance. 2 good American soldiers are dead in California because people like Washington thought they could trust the enemy." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. Hiroshi felt the familiar weight of collective guilt, the burden of being held responsible for the actions of people he had never met, fighting a war he had never chosen. But this time, something was different. The months at Camp Shelby had changed him, had given him a sense of individual identity that transcended national categories. "I am not them," he said quietly. "I am Hiroshi Tanaka. I have worked beside your men, played baseball with your men, shared meals and stories and hopes with your men. Judge me by my actions, not by the actions of others who happen to share my face." It was a speech that might have resonated with Bobby McKenna or James Washington or any of the Americans who had come to know Hiroshi as an individual. But Kowalski was operating from a different set of assumptions, shaped by recent tragedy and long-held prejudices. "Your actions?" Kowalski laughed harshly. "Your action was surrendering instead of dying like a real soldier. Your action was collaborating with your captors instead of maintaining resistance. Your action was playing games while your country fights a war. Those are the actions I'm judging you by." The other guards shifted nervously, uncomfortable with the direction the confrontation was taking but uncertain how to intervene. They had heard about the friendship between some of their colleagues and the Japanese prisoners, but they had also heard about California, about the dangers of treating the enemy as anything other than a threat to be contained. It was at that moment, with tension crackling in the air like electricity before a storm, that Bobby McKenna appeared around the corner of the communications building. He had been searching for Hiroshi since the alert began, worried about his friend's safety in the chaos that had engulfed the base. What he saw when he reached the baseball field made his blood run cold. "Sergeant Kowalski," Bobby called out, his voice carrying the authority of his rank and the urgency of the situation. "What's the status here?" Kowalski turned toward Bobby without lowering his weapon. "Found this prisoner outside the compound during the alert, Sergeant. Looks like he was trying to escape, maybe coordinate with others. I'm following standard security protocols." Bobby took in the scene quickly, Hiroshi with his hands raised, the other guards looking uncertain, Kowalski's finger on the trigger of a weapon pointed at a man who had become not just an ally but a friend. Every instinct told him to defuse the situation immediately, but he also knew that challenging Kowalski directly could escalate the confrontation beyond anyone's ability to control. "I can vouch for this prisoner's location," Bobby said carefully. "He was on authorized work detail when the alert sounded. I gave him instructions to remain in place until further orders." "You gave him instructions?" Kowalski's voice rose with incredulous anger. "Since when do we give instructions to prisoners instead of orders? Since when do we trust the enemy to follow instructions without direct supervision? This is exactly the kind of soft thinking that got those guards killed in California." The mention of California was like throwing gasoline on a fire. Every American soldier on the base had heard about the incident, had felt the collective anger and betrayal that came with the death of their comrades. The idea that similar trust might be misplaced at Camp Shelby touched the deepest fears of men far from home, responsible for containing an enemy that their own government described as fanatical and treacherous. But Bobby had seen something different in his months working with Hiroshi and the other prisoners. He had seen men struggling with the same fears, the same homesickness, the same hope for survival that motivated every soldier regardless of uniform. The idea of treating Hiroshi as a threat, of reducing him to nothing more than his nationality, felt like a betrayal of everything they had learned about the possibility for understanding across the deepest divides. "Sergeant," Bobby said, his voice steady but carrying an edge of authority, "I'm ordering you to lower your weapon. This prisoner is not a threat, and this situation is not what it appears to be." It was a moment that crystallized months of tension between different philosophies of how to conduct the war, how to treat the enemy, and how to maintain one's own humanity in the face of systematic dehumanization. Kowalski had to choose between obeying a direct order from a superior and acting on his conviction that the Japanese prisoners represented an ongoing threat to American lives. For several seconds, nobody moved. The weight of decision hung over the baseball field like a physical presence, determining not just the immediate fate of everyone involved but the future of everything that had been built between Americans and Japanese at Camp Shelby. Then, from the direction of the motor pool, came the sound of running feet and shouting voices. James Washington appeared, followed by Tony Rickey and several other American soldiers who had been searching for missing prisoners during the lockdown. Their arrival changed the dynamic completely, transforming what had been a private confrontation between individuals into a public test of competing loyalties. "Bobby!" Washington called out as he approached. "Thank God you found him. We've been looking everywhere. Captain Mitchell needs all work detail prisoners accounted for immediately." The mention of Captain Mitchell's direct involvement shifted the situation decisively. Whatever personal feelings Kowalski might have about prisoner policy, he couldn't ignore a direct chain of command that led to the base commander. Slowly, reluctantly, he lowered his weapon. But the damage had been done. The trust that had been so carefully built over months of shared experience had been shattered in minutes of fear and suspicion. As Hiroshi was escorted back to the prisoner compound under heavy guard, he realized that the experiment in cross-cultural understanding had probably come to an end, victim of events beyond anyone's control and prejudices deeper than individual relationships could overcome. That night, as the all-clear sounded and the base returned to normal operations, Hiroshi lay on his cot in the prisoner barracks and reflected on how quickly things could change. Just that morning, he had been a trusted worker, a teammate, a friend to men who wore different uniforms but shared similar hopes and fears. Now he was once again just a prisoner, a potential threat, a representative of an enemy nation rather than an individual with his own story and struggles. But something had changed in those months of playing baseball and working alongside Americans. Hiroshi had learned that understanding was possible across even the deepest cultural and political divides. He had experienced what it meant to be judged by his actions rather than his ancestry, to be valued for his contributions rather than condemned for his associations. That knowledge couldn't be erased by policy changes or security alerts or the prejudices of men who had never taken the time to see him as anything other than an enemy. More importantly, he had learned something about courage that went beyond the battlefield heroics celebrated in military culture. True courage, he now understood, lay in the willingness to see humanity in one's enemies, to build bridges across differences, to risk one's own safety and reputation in service of principles larger than self-interest. The test of that courage would come sooner than anyone expected. 3 days after the false alert, real danger arrived at Camp Shelby in the form of a winter storm that caught the entire region unprepared. What began as a routine cold front developed into a blizzard that dumped 18 inches of snow on an area that rarely saw winter weather, accompanied by winds that knocked out power lines and blocked roads throughout southern Mississippi. The storm hit just after midnight, and by dawn it was clear that Camp Shelby was facing a genuine emergency. The base's heating systems, designed for the mild winters typical of the region, were overwhelmed by temperatures that dropped below zero. Emergency generators struggled to maintain power to essential facilities, and the backup systems that should have provided redundancy proved inadequate to the unprecedented conditions. By the second day of the storm, the situation had become critical. Several buildings had suffered structural damage from the weight of snow and ice, the medical facility was operating on emergency power that was beginning to fail, and communications with the outside world had been severed when the main radio antenna collapsed under the weight of ice. Most seriously, a fire had broken out in one of the main barracks buildings, apparently caused by desperate soldiers using unauthorized heating devices to keep warm. The combination of old wood construction, inadequate fire suppression systems, and blocked access roads made the fire a major threat not just to the building involved but to the entire base. Captain Mitchell found himself facing decisions that no training had prepared him for. With limited personnel, failing infrastructure, and no prospect of outside assistance until the storm passed, he had to prioritize which facilities to protect, which personnel to evacuate, and how to maintain order in conditions that were rapidly approaching chaos. It was in this context of genuine crisis that the artificial boundaries between American and Japanese, between guard and prisoner, between friend and enemy, began to blur in ways that policy could never have anticipated. The first breakthrough came when Kenji Nakamura, the former teacher whose English skills had made him one of the few Japanese prisoners selected for the suspended recreational program, approached the guards at the prisoner compound with an unexpected offer. "Many of my fellow prisoners," he explained to the corporal on duty, "have skills that might be useful in this emergency. We have men who worked in construction before the war, others with experience in electrical systems, some who understand fire suppression techniques. We are prisoners, but we are also human beings who do not wish to see people suffer needlessly." The corporal, a young man from Minnesota who understood winter emergencies better than most of his southern colleagues, recognized the value of the offer but lacked the authority to make such a decision. He passed the proposal up the chain of command, where it eventually reached Captain Mitchell in the crisis command center he had established in the administration building. Mitchell's first instinct was to reject the offer out of hand. Using enemy prisoners for emergency assistance violated every protocol he had been trained to follow. But looking around at his overwhelmed staff, listening to reports of failing systems and mounting casualties, he realized that protocol might be a luxury he couldn't afford. "What kind of assistance are they talking about?" he asked. The corporal consulted his notes. The Japanese spokesman mentioned experience with emergency construction, temporary electrical systems, and fire suppression techniques. He also said several of the prisoners had worked in dangerous conditions before the war and might be useful in rescue operations if buildings start collapsing. It was an offer that required Mitchell to choose between regulations and lives, between the safety of following established procedures and the greater safety that might come from accepting help regardless of its source. In the end, the decision was easier than he had expected. "Bring me the spokesman," he ordered, "and get Sergeant McKenna in here. If we're going to do this, we're going to do it right." 20 minutes later, Kenji Nakamura found himself in the American Command Center, surrounded by officers and maps and radio equipment that represented the nerve center of base operations. It was a level of trust that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances, but the storm had created circumstances that were anything but normal. "Your people," Captain Mitchell said without preamble. "You say they can help with our emergency situation. What exactly are you proposing?" Kenji had prepared for this moment, understanding that he was negotiating not just for the opportunity to help but for a fundamental shift in how both sides viewed their relationship. "Captain, we propose that qualified prisoners work alongside your personnel to address the most critical needs. Fire suppression, structural repair, medical assistance, power restoration, whatever skills we have that match your needs. And in return, nothing, sir. This is not a negotiation for better treatment or special privileges. This is simply an offer to help fellow human beings in a time of need." It was exactly the right answer, carrying a moral authority that transcended political and military considerations. Captain Mitchell looked around at his staff, seeing in their faces the same recognition that he felt. This was an opportunity not just to address the immediate crisis but to demonstrate what was possible when people chose cooperation over conflict. "Very well," he decided. "But understand that this is a temporary arrangement, limited to the duration of the emergency. Any prisoner who volunteers will work under direct American supervision, and any misconduct will result in immediate return to detention with serious consequences. Within an hour, more than 30 Japanese prisoners had volunteered for emergency duty, including Hiroshi, whose months of working in the motor pool had given him experience with electrical systems that were badly needed for power restoration efforts. As he put on borrowed American work gear and prepared to venture out into the storm, he felt a familiar mixture of anticipation and anxiety. But this time was different. He wasn't trying to prove himself as a baseball player or demonstrate his worthiness for acceptance into American recreational activities. He was simply doing what needed to be done, using whatever skills he possessed to help address a crisis that affected everyone on the base regardless of nationality or uniform. The work was dangerous and exhausting. Temperatures well below freezing made every task more difficult, while high winds and continuing snowfall created constant hazards. But working side by side with American soldiers to repair downed power lines, clear blocked roads, and evacuate damaged buildings, Hiroshi experienced something that transcended the careful bridge building of the baseball games. This was necessity stripped of politics, cooperation based not on policy or goodwill but on the fundamental human need to survive and protect others. When a roof beam threatened to collapse on a group of soldiers, Hiroshi didn't think about whether they were American or Japanese, friend or enemy. He simply acted, using his strength and positioning to help support the beam until everyone could get clear. When the medical facility lost power and patients needed to be moved to safety, he worked alongside Corporal Washington to carry stretchers through snow that was waist-deep, their breath-forming clouds in the frigid air as they struggled to save lives that belonged to people they might never see again. And when the fire in the main barracks building threatened to spread to adjacent structures, he found himself working directly with Sergeant Kowalski, the same man who had pointed a rifle at him just days before. The immediate needs of fire suppression left no room for personal animosity or political disagreement. They passed buckets, operated pumps, and coordinated evacuation efforts as efficiently as if they had been teammates for years. It was only later, after the immediate danger had passed and they were catching their breath outside the smoldering building, that Kowalski spoke to him directly. "That was good work in there," he said quietly, not quite meeting Hiroshi's eyes. "Professional. Effective." It wasn't an apology, and it wasn't a complete reversal of the suspicions that had led to their earlier confrontation. But it was an acknowledgement of individual merit that transcended categories of nationality and allegiance. For Hiroshi, it represented something more valuable than any formal recognition could have provided.